Hello and welcome to this presentation. My name is Professor Tony Machin and my colleague Professor Natalie Gasson and I are talking about the test of psychological literacy revised and employability skills. We would just like to commence our presentation with an acknowledgement of country, and we do acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that USQ and Curtin Uni have been built and whose cultures and customs continue to nurture this land. We also pay respect to elders past, present and future. I'm just going to turn off the camera preview and then start talking about our presentation. The background is that the test of psychological literacy is a very important development in terms of assessing psychological literacy. Quite a bit of effort went into developing this instrument by staff at Curtin Uni and in some other locations. And the measure overall is targeting the ability to apply psychological literacy to personal, professional and societal needs. There's a number of systematic reviews and commentaries which have highlighted the need, the critical need to assess psychological literacy in a valid way. So through a process which has been outlined previously, for example at the last AusPLAT Conference, a number of domains were identified, and for each of those domains a number of scenarios were created. Now these scenarios are fairly brief, and I'll give you an example in a minute of what a scenario looks like. But at the same time, a fairly detailed scoring guide was created. So the idea was that as a person responded to each of these scenarios in writing, then those responses would be able to be scored according to the scoring guide. So a total of 80, more than 86, but eventually about 86 scenarios across the 13 domains. So here's the sample item that I was talking about. You were chatting to Putri, an exchange student from Indonesia, about plans for the future. She comments that she's very surprised by how much freedom Australian students have to decide what they want to do and wonders why their families don't have more of a say. Now immediately you might be thinking that this is tapping into the ability to apply psychological knowledge in a culturally appropriate way. And the two-part response that the original test has always required is how much you respond and then what psychological theory or concepts might be relevant here. And this is the way the test has been administered until recently. So as an example, the marking guide suggests that the answer needs to indicate students would need to explain to Putri, the person asking the question, that in some cultures the individual takes precedence over the group, e.g. more individualistic cultures or societies, while in others the person's relationship within the group is more important. As in collectivist societies, Australia is more of an individualist society, and an answer of that kind will get 1 mark, and then the theory or concept is collectivist versus individualist societies. A 2nd mark would be applied for a total of 2 marks, and that would then apply to each of the scenarios. Okay, so this is actually incredibly time consuming. If you've ever tried to manually score written responses, open-ended responses to any kind of assessment, knowing what the response is trying to convey and then assessing it for its quality are actually quite sophisticated and complex judgments that you can make. And just as an example, an honours student that I supervised at USQ and I applied the marking guide, the marking scoring guide, carefully, I think, to the research methods items in the test of psychological literacy, and we were unable to agree on many of the responses. So while we might have had very closely aligned scores in terms of their rankings, so who was better and who was poorer overall, our absolute levels of scores were many points apart. So this is quite interesting, that even with a detailed scoring guide, it is actually somewhat difficult to achieve a consolidated or a consensus outcome Again, not necessarily in terms of the rankings that are achieved with the scoring, but particularly with getting this sort of the calibration right, getting the absolute level. Right, so we've gone down a different track by developing a revised version of the test of psych literacy, or at least 13 of the research method scenarios, where each of the scenarios has 5 responses, and we've then developed a scoring key for those scenarios and started to assess links between test of psych literacy revised and other constructs, which we will talk about during this presentation. Now, conceptually, the thinking that has been applied comes from situational judgment test methodology. There's an enormously important set of ideas that come through organizational psychology as it's applied to recruitment and selection processes in organizations, and really has developed quite a long way. So each of the assessments that a person is completing focuses usually on some sort of job relevant knowledge and can focus or push the respondents more towards what they should or what they would do in a situation. And this again helps to differentiate between an assessment of maximal or typical performance. So in the assessment world, these are different goals that are sought in a selection process. The research does tend to indicate that situational judgment tests, according to this type of methodology, do add incremental validity over other important attributes that contribute to people's ability to perform effectively. So cognitive ability and personality are two that are most commonly looked at in this type of research. Now, the same methodology has been applied to assessing understanding or competence in other domains, and health competence is an area that Robinson et al. Focused on. So, as an example, they created some scenarios with various responses and asked the respondents to indicate which of those were more likely to undertake. And I'll just give you a small example from their table 1, which is replicated from their study. Now, the scenario is very simple. Scott wants to get in shape but realizes he hates exercising. No one I know is in this situation, of course. So 4 ways of responding might be: you suggest Scott try out a few different types of exercise to see what works, or that Scott works out very hard for a short period of time, or try dieting instead, or just stop exercising. And in this situation or scenario, you are asked to indicate how likely it would be that you would do any of those 4, or make any of those 4 responses, from not at all likely to very likely. So for each of the 4 responses, there is a choice from 1 to 5 that's selected, which is the self-likelihood rating. Now, you can see there that maybe not very likely to say work out hard for a short period of time or try dieting, but more likely to do the other 2. This methodology then uses subject matter expert ratings to develop what are called effectiveness norms. So if I ask this group that's watching this presentation now, how likely are you to recommend try out a few different types of exercise to see what works? We might achieve similar results to the expert norms or the effectiveness norms that are here, with most people saying yes, 4 or 5. And it's almost evenly split, 40% say 4, 60% say 5. So we use these effectively as weightings. You get a 0.4 weighting if you happen, so forget this number under self-likelihood, you just get the proportion for the choice that you made corresponding to that effectiveness norm. So once you've selected the 4 option, 0.4, the 2 option, 0.3, the 2 option for this one, 0.33, and the 4 option for this one, and combine those, you get an average effectiveness score. So you get the idea. It does depend on, you can see subject matter experts might differ quite markedly on some of the options that are offered there. So with the 13 research methods items, we focused on those in particular because we were already using a measure of understanding of research concepts and statistics, and we also then wanted to include some other measures. So with those 13 items in particular, 5 responses were developed, and these were essentially from students' responses. They were looked through all of the students' responses and tried to come up with some which we felt were better and some which were poorer. We also used the vast number of studies that have been conducted at Curtin, where various groups, including students, had responded to those same items. Now, to develop the scoring key, I sent those actual responses to subject matter experts, which were colleagues who were experienced psychology educators or academics, and then those scores were averaged effectiveness norms were constructed so that for the respondents, the students, then we were able to make effectiveness ratings for each of their responses. Remember, if they said 1, we would choose the proportion of SMEs who responded 1, and that would be their score. If they said 2, etc. So we've got these effectiveness norms, we've created an effectiveness score, but that's not the only scoring method we've chosen. We've also used a straightforward distance method, and I'll try not to spend too much time talking about that because we might just run out of time. Now, in terms of what the SMEs responded, we have a scenario here, and the SMEs were asked to indicate how effectively or completely their scenario corresponded to an application of psychological science. So for the first scenario, we've got SME ratings, and they were averaged. Now, the distance score that I mentioned briefly is simply the difference between what the student has rated and the average SME rating. So it's an absolute measure of how close they are to the expert ratings. So those distance scores were added up across all of the 5 options for each of the 13 scenarios, as well as the weighted effectiveness rating, to arrive at 2 different types of scores, a mean distance score and a mean effectiveness rating. Now, what are we comparing to? We've been using the psychological research inventory of concepts for a little while as one of the validation measures, 20-item vignette-based multiple choice measure assessing knowledge about research methods and statistics in psychology. To expand our understanding, then, we've also moved to looking at employability skills. Now, these are skills that help to capture students' confidence in their ability to undertake a range of important job-relevant tasks, and the measure that we're using is the Employability Skills Self-Efficacy Scale. The website gives students the ability to complete the measure and get feedback, so it's a very useful thing to know about, and completely free. You can ask students to go there, or you can also administer them to cohorts or classes. Now, here's a little bit of descriptive information. Essentially, the measures that came first got better responses, the psychological literacy ones. The ones that came later had fewer respondents, and this is still a data collection that's occurring, but at least we've got about 80 students, and we've calculated some mean scores for these 4 types of employability skills. The psychological research inventory of concepts has a total score with one of the items dropped, the mean distance score from the psych literacy scenarios, and the mean effectiveness score. And I do just need to sum up in the next minute or two, given time is just about up. Just to make it really kind of simple, the effectiveness score, the last set of values down here, is probably the one that we're going to go with. It correlates more strongly with the PRIC than the distance score. Forget the negative sign, that just is the way distance is calculated. But also the mean distance score didn't really correlate much with any of the employability skills, whereas the effectiveness score did correlate with 3 of the 4 employability skills measure. And it correlates negative 0.53 with the distance score. So they're not measuring exactly the same thing, these 2 scores. We looked at some reliability analysis just to make sure that the scenarios are actually all contributing, and yes, they were for the distance score and for the effectiveness score as well. What's left to do is more sophisticated item response theory modelling and multivariate item response theory, and looking at incremental validity analyses. And we're very happy to welcome any questions about these. Thank you very much.